And the word revelation comes from the Latin root revelare, which just means to lift the veil. So he sees Christ not as embodying a truth that is foreign to us, but he rather sees Christ as sort of lifting the veil to show us the sacredness that is at the heart of our being and all being. So in that sense, he is our memory. And this is so radically different from the Christ figure, or the doctrines about Christ that come down in once again in a lot of our Western Christian history from the 4th century onwards. Because in most of that teaching, Christ is seen as essentially foreign to what is deepest in us. And this takes us back, Arjun, to the doctrine of original sin that we touched on earlier. And this is a doctrine that has been used to teach that what is deepest in us, and in that sense, what is most original in us, is opposed to God rather than of God.
Right.
So I think this, for me, this is one of the most important contributions of the Celtic stream to the rest of the Christian stream. I think that one of the wisdoms that this tradition offers us is that a love of the Christ figure, or the love of the Christ mystery, equals, in my mind, a love of the light that is at the heart of your being and at the heart of all being. So, and so much Christianity has wanted to teach in its doctrines that a love of Christ is somehow essentially foreign to what is at the very heart of my being, or at the heart of your being. I have a lovely memory that's come to me about giving a talk in Virginia, an spiritual interfaith talk. And there was a rabbi, an imam, and I was there as the Christian teacher. I mean, it sounds like the beginning of a joke, doesn't it? So we were asked at one point, the dialogue sort of opened up and people were able to ask questions from the floor. And someone asked us if we would speak about the doctrine of original sin. And this, of course, is a Christian problem. This is not a Jewish problem. It's not a Muslim problem. Both of those traditions begin by remembering that we are made of God, that we're made in the image of God. But the rabbi was the first to respond, and he said, original sin. He said, that to most Jews would mean that was a really original sin. That was a really creative sin. And at that moment, I thought, thank God for interfaith dialogue. I mean, here this rabbi has got a room full of Christians laughing about this absurd doctrine of original sin. And I say absurd, and I'm also prepared to use the word perverted. This is a perverted teaching. One only has to hold a newborn child in your arms to know that this is a sick doctrine. And again, it's been used by empire from the 4th century onwards to make it very convenient not to treat everyone as essentially holy, as essentially sacred.
Yeah, absolutely. As someone growing up under that doctrine, I have no ill will towards my parents. We've all sort of moved away from Catholicism in some respect in recent years, but it's an idea that they inherited from their parents, and their parents inherited from their parents. And you kind of, after reading your book, I realized how old these ideas are, and it takes me back to that Carl Jung line: people don't have ideas, ideas have people. It's something that we've been living with for so long. But even as a kid, I remember when we were first taught that in CCD, that was like the one idea that I had the hardest time wrapping my head around, because it just felt so counterintuitive to the way I wanted to feel about myself, to the way I felt about others that had not been baptized, the way I felt about, my brother and my family. And I think perverted is an accurate word, because to teach someone that they come into this world inherently bad or inherently stained is just psychologically damaging, and I think it makes people more pliable, which going all the way back to the empire, is I think where they wanted people to be psychologically.
Yeah. Yes, much more dependent on being told what truth is and told how to behave. But that it is a psychologically damaging teaching, I believe. I mean, if you tell a child that she is ugly, that she's stupid, that she doesn't know anything, at some level, the child starts believing that statement. And I think that many of us have lived under that self doubt, and I think there's a great teacher, a spiritual teacher in California named Matthew Fox, and he 25, maybe 30 years ago, wrote a seminal work called Original Blessing, in which he's really saying, no, not original sin, original blessedness, original sacredness. And interestingly, one of the other phrases that Matthew has developed, in part because there's often quite a reaction, if you've been trained in the Roman Catholic or sort of Reformed Protestant traditions, if you hear someone challenging the doctrine of original sin, they sometimes think you're being naive and saying, that we're all sort of perfect, or that there isn't a place to prophetically denounce what is false. And this certainly isn't true of the 9 teachers that I draw from. I mean, they are very prophetic often about denouncing our falseness or our capacity for terrible wrong. But one of the subsequent phrases that someone like Matthew Fox has developed is that we could speak about original woundedness, that the world that we come into is a wounded world. The nations that we're born into are wounded nations. Our families carry wounds, generational wounds often. So in the Celtic world, very importantly, grace and nature are not seen as opposed to each other. So that in a lot of Christian teaching, it's been said, that our nature is sinful, and that grace is given to somehow change our nature, or grace is given in opposition to what is deepest in our nature. But in the Celtic Christian tradition, again, someone like Eriugena, he says that grace is the gift, nature is the gift of being, and our being is essentially sacred.